Former Ktharan Fleet Commander Veldus dragged his massive six-limbed body into the metal chair, each movement sending sharp pain through old battle wounds. His thick, armored hide was covered in scars that told stories of a war he desperately wanted to forget. Some scars were from human plasma weapons, others from shrapnel when his own ships exploded round him. The worst scar ran across his chest where a human soldier had tried to gut him with a crude metal blade during hand-to-hand combat. Across the small, dimly lit room sat military historian Gwendol, a younger Ktharan with bright, curious eyes who had never seen real battle. Between them, a small recording device hummed quietly, its red light blinking steadily as it captured every word. The room smelled of disinfectant and fierce sweat. To sense that always reminded Veldus of those terrible months when everything went wrong. Gwendol adjusted his recording equipment nervously. He had interviewed dozens of war veterans, but none carried the haunted look that Veldus wore like a second skin. The old commander's eyes constantly darted toward the exits, and his claws unconsciously flexed as if expecting an attack at any moment. "Tell me about the humans," Gwendol prompted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Veldus as large, reptilian eyes dimmed as memories flooded back. His mandibles clicked together in the nervous habit he had developed since the war. "We called them the soft ones before everything started. Sounds stupid now, doesn't it?" He let out a bitter laugh that sounded more like a growl. "Our intelligence division spent months studying them. They showed us pictures of these pink, fleshy creatures with no natural armor, no claws, no protective scales. They looked so weak and helpless. The reports said they were fragile water bags from some forgotten backwater system that most civilized species had never even heard of. They didn't have faster-than-light travel until recently. Their weapons were primitive chemical explosives and simple energy beams. They should have been easy prey." Veldus paused to take a shaky breath, his chest rising and falling heavily. The High Command was so confident they gave us just 3 days to conquer their entire home system. 3 days. Can you imagine? They treated it like a training exercise for our newest recruits. Admiral Jektar even joked that we would be home in time for the Harvest Festival. We assembled the largest invasion fleet in galactic history for what everyone thought would be target practice. 2,000 ships of every class you can imagine. Massive dreadnoughts that could split planets in half. Fast attack cruisers with shields that could deflect small suns. Carrier ships filled with fighter squadrons. Our crews were veterans who had conquered 17 different star systems. We had weapons powerful enough to crack moons and turn entire worlds into glass. The old commander's voice grew quieter, more personal. "I was so confident about this easy victory that I brought my nephew Kurthan along with me." The boy had just graduated from the Naval Academy with top honors. He was young, eager, and hungry for his first taste of real combat. He kept asking me to tell him war stories during the journey to their system. Veldus' claws scraped against the metal armrest as his grip tightened. Kurthan was everything a young Ktharan warrior should be: strong, intelligent, brave to the point of recklessness. He had studied every famous battle in our military history. He could recite the names of our greatest generals and their winning strategies. He was so excited to finally see action and prove himself worthy of our family's military tradition. I promised his mother, my sister, that I would keep him safe and help him earn his first battle honors. She trusted me to bring her son home as a hero. That promise haunts me every single night. Veldus stopped talking and stared at the wall for a long moment. When he continued, his voice was barely audible. "I should have known something was terribly wrong the moment we arrived at their solar system. We dropped out of hyperspace expecting to find their pathetic little fleet waiting to defend their home world. Instead, We found absolutely nothing. The humans had vanished their entire military. Every ship, every space station, every orbital defense platform had simply disappeared. Our long-range scanners couldn't detect a single armed vessel anywhere in the system. The space round their planet was completely empty except for some civilian traffic and communication satellites. Quendel leaned forward, his recorder capturing every word. But they hadn't fled. Had they? Veldos looked directly at him, and for the first time during the interview. His eyes showed pure terror. No, young historian, they hadn't fled in terror like we thought. They were already inside our formation, waiting for us to make our first mistake. The humans had turned invisibility into an art form, and we were about to become their masterpiece. When our scanners finally detected their ships, we almost laughed out loud. Veldos continued, his voice growing steadier as he remembered those first fatal moments. Their vessels looked like something built by children playing with scrap. Metal. Ugly metal boxes welded together with no artistic design or elegant curves like our beautiful warships. Their engines were crude chemical rockets that belched fire and smoke like ancient industrial machinery. He shook his head slowly. Our weapons officers barely bothered to target them. Our advanced sensors registered these human ships as barely above space junk. No energy shields worth mentioning. Armor plating that looked paper-thin compared to our reinforced hulls, and weapons that seemed like toys compared to our plasma cannons and antimatter torpedoes. Admiral Jektar gave the order to advance toward their third planet, the one they call Earth. We moved in perfect formation. 2,000 ships ranged in the classical attack pattern that had conquered 17 worlds. Our dreadnoughts led the charge, their massive hulls bristling with enough firepower to sterilize an entire continent. Behind them came the cruisers and destroyers, ready to mop up any survivors. Veldo's S-claws began scraping against the metal, sheer, leaving deep scratches in the armrest. That's when everything went wrong. When we moved close enough to begin orbital bombardment, they struck from everywhere at once, and I mean everywhere. The first attack came from what we thought was empty space. Massive human vessels suddenly materialized from inside hollowed-out asteroids that had been drifting in the system's outer belt. These weren't small fighters, but full-sized warships that had somehow carved out hiding spaces inside solid rock. They had been sitting there for weeks, maybe months, waiting for us to get close enough. Before our gunners could even react, these hidden ships opened fire with weapons we had never seen before. Not energy beams or plasma bolts, but solid metal projectiles moving at incredible speeds. Kinetic kill vehicles, they called them. Chunks of dense metal accelerated to nearly light speed that punched through our shields like they were made of paper. The old commander's breathing became heavier as the memories flooded back. But that was just the beginning. More human ships appeared from what we had dismissed as floating space debris. Chunks of destroyed vessels and broken satellites suddenly, powered up with hidden engines and weapon systems. They had been drifting cold and dead for so long that our sensors completely ignored them. The most terrifying part was when we realized some of the attacks were coming from behind us, from our own supply convoy. Somehow, the humans had managed to board and take control of our own ships days earlier. During our journey to their system, they had been hiding inside our fleet the entire time, learning our tactics and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Veldo stopped talking and took several deep breaths before continuing. The first wave of their coordinated attack destroyed 300 of our vessels in less than 5 minutes. 300 ships, each one carrying a crew of 50 warriors, all gone in the blink of an eye. But that wasn't the nightmare part that still wakes me up screaming. The real nightmare was watching what happened when their ships started taking damage Any civilized species would retreat when their vessels were crippled. Standard military protocol across the galaxy says you withdraw damaged ships to repair them and fight another day. But humans don't follow standard protocol. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. I watched in horror as human crews deliberately rammed their damaged ships into our dreadnoughts. These weren't accidents or desperate last resort maneuvers. They weaponized their own deaths as part of their battle strategy. There was one moment that will haunt me forever. A human destroyer had taken direct hits from our plasma cannons. Half its hull was missing, atmosphere was venting out into space, and fires were burning throughout the ship. Any sane crew would have abandoned ship immediately. Instead, they turned directly toward our command flagship and accelerated at maximum speed. Veldo's entire body began to shake as he relived the memory. The human crew could have ejected in escape pods. They had time to save themselves, but they stayed at their posts. Every single one of them, as their dying ship accelerated toward US, they broadcast war cries over all communication channels. Not screams of fear or calls for help, but actual battle songs. I was monitoring the communications when it happened. These humans were singing as they flew their broken ship directly into our most powerful warship. They turned their deaths into some kind of twisted celebration, screaming things like "Remember the Alamo" and "For Earth and Glory" right up until the moment of impact. My nephew Curthan was stationed. Ed on that flagship as a junior weapons officer. He was probably at his post when the human ship hit. Doing his duty just like I had taught him, the explosion was so massive it lit up space for thousands of kilometers in every direction. Veldos looked directly at Gwendol with eyes full of pain. The humans killed my nephew with a ship that was already dead. They turned a destroyed vessel into a missile and used it to take our best warship with them. That's when I realized we weren't fighting a normal military force. We were fighting something completely insane after losing so many ships in there. First ambush. We pulled back and regrouped. Veldos continued, his voice becoming more strained as he recalled the desperate attempts to salvage their mission. Admiral Jektar called an emergency war council. We had lost nearly a quarter of our fleet in the opening minutes, but we still had overwhelming numbers and superior technology. The Admiral was furious and demanded we show these primitives how real warfare was conducted. We fell back to standard Galactic Military Academy tactics that had worked for centuries. We raised our energy barriers to maximum strength, ranged our ships in proper defensive formations, and coordinated our firing solutions through the fleet's central computer systems. These were time-tested strategies that had conquered entire star systems. Veldos' mandibles clicked rapidly as his agitation grew. But the humans completely ignored every rule of civilized galactic warfare. It was like they had never heard of the Geneva Conventions of Space or the Warriors Code that every species follows. They fought like wild animals with no honor or respect for proper military conduct. The first thing that shocked us was how they used their civilian ships in every other war we had fought. Enemy civilians would flee to safe zones or neutral territories. Non-combatant vessels were clearly marked and stayed out of battle zones, but human civilians charged directly at our warships like they were combat veterans. I watched cargo haulers that should have been carrying food and supplies ram into our destroyers. These massive freight ships had been secretly filled with explosives and turned into giant bombs. Passenger liners that normally carried families on vacation had been converted into missile boats bristling with crude but effective weapons. The old commander's voice grew more disturbed. We couldn't tell which ships were military targets and which were supposed to be protected. Civilians. Our targeting computers kept giving us conflicting information because humans don't make that distinction. Every ship, every station. Every floating piece of metal became a potential weapon in their hands. Our weapons officers kept asking for permission to fire on civilian targets, but our own military laws prevented us from attacking non-combatants. The humans used our honor code against us. They hid weapons on hospital ships and turned school transports into attack vessels. They made us choose between following our principles or defending ourselves. Veldo's paused too. White sweat from his scaled forehead. But the worst part was how they refused to retreat when they were supposed to. In proper warfare, when a ship is disabled and can no longer fight effectively, the crew surrenders or withdraws. It's basic military logic that has kept wars from becoming total massacres for thousands of years. Humans don't understand the concept of acceptable losses. When their ships were crippled by our weapons, instead of surrendering, the crews would override their life support systems to create toxic gas clouds. They would vent their own atmosphere and fill their ships with poisonous chemicals to kill anyone who tried to board them. I led several boarding parties personally, thinking we could capture some prisoners and learn about their tactics. Every time we cut through their hull and entered their ships, we found death traps waiting for us. The corridors were filled with improvised explosive devices made from the strangest materials you could imagine. His voice became almost incredulous. They turned medical supplies into bombs. Bandages soaked in chemicals that would explode when we stepped on them. Surgical instruments rigged as shrapnel grenades. They even weaponized their food, creating mines out of cooking equipment and cleaning supplies. One boarding party found a human ship where the crew had turned their own drinking water into acid and rigged the plumbing system to spray it at intruders. Another discovered that the humans had modified their artificial gravity generators to crush anyone who entered specific rooms. They booby-trapped everything, including their own dead bodies. Vildos' claws dug deeper into the chair as he recalled the most disturbing memory. I will never forget one particular engagement that showed me just how insane these creatures really are. We had surrounded a lone human frigate that was clearly outgunned and outnumbered. Our ships formed a perfect circle round it, weapons trained on every possible escape route. According to every rule of warfare in the galaxy, they should have immediately surrendered. We even broadcast the standard terms of honorable defeat, offering to take prisoners and treat wounded according to military law. Any civilized species would have accepted those terms rather than face certain death instead. The human crew began broadcasting music over all communication frequencies, not distress calls or surrender messages, but actual music. They hijacked every radio channel in the battle zone and filled space with this strange, powerful sound that gave me chills. Quendel leaned forward with intense curiosity. Music. What kind of music? Vildos' eyes grew distant as he remembered. Something they called Ride of the Valkyries. It was unlike anything I had ever heard. Dramatic, thunderous, beautiful, and terrifying all at the same time. The music built to this incredible crescendo that seemed to shake the very fabric of space around us. As the music reached its peak, the human frigate deliberately detonated its own reactor core. They turned their nuclear power source into a massive bomb that took out two of our heavy cruisers in the explosion. These humans died singing. Historian. They turned their deaths into some kind of artistic performance that was both horrible and magnificent. That's when I realized we weren't just fighting soldiers. We were fighting poets who had weaponized their own culture. By the fourth day of what was supposed to be a 3-day conquest, something truly terrifying became clear to all of us, Vildos said, his voice beginning to crack under the weight of the memories. We weren't fighting a normal army or even a particularly clever military force. We were fighting evolution itself, watching an entire species adapt and improve in real time right before our eyes. Every single battle we fought made them smarter and more dangerous. It was like watching a computer program write itself while it was running. Our military strategists would develop new tactics overnight, deploy them in the morning, and by afternoon the humans had already figured out perfect counters to everything we threw at them. Veldo's breathing became more labored as he continued. Our war computers were some of the most advanced in the galaxy. They could calculate millions of battle scenarios in seconds and predict enemy movements with 90% accuracy. But the humans adapted faster than our machines could think. Weapons that worked perfectly in one engagement became completely useless in the next. I remember watching our plasma cannons tear through human shields during a morning battle. Our gunners were celebrating, thinking they had found a weakness. By that same afternoon, every human ship had modified their shield frequencies to deflect our plasma completely. They had analyzed our weapons, figured out the physics, and developed countermeasures in less than 6 hours. But the most disturbing part was how they shared information. We discovered they had something called the Internet that connected every human mind across their entire species. When one human learned something new about our tactics, every other human knew it instantly. They weren't just individual soldiers learning from experience. They were a collective intelligence that got smarter with every mistake we made. The old commander's claws scraped nervously against the chair. I watched human pilots perform flight maneuvers that should have been physically impossible. Their ships would execute turns and accelerations that generated G-forces strong enough to crush any known species into paste. We calculated that pulling those kinds of maneuvers should have liquefied their internal organs. But humans didn't just survive these impossible maneuvers. They seemed to thrive on them. They would laugh over their communication channels while pulling turns that would have killed our best pilots. Some of them even seemed to enjoy the experience, whooping and cheering as they pushed their fragile bodies beyond all reasonable limits. During one engagement, I watched a human fighter pilot pull a maneuver that generated over 15 Gs of force. Our medical computers said no biological creature could survive that kind of acceleration. The pilot not only survived, but immediately went into a combat role and shot down 3 of our interceptors while his ship was still shaking from the stress. Veldo's paused to collect himself before continuing with the most disturbing revelation. We started capturing human pilots to study how they could survive these impossible conditions. What we found was even more terrifying than their natural entrance. They were modifying their own biology during combat using chemical stimulants. That would be lethal poison to any other species. These humans would inject themselves with drugs that increased their reaction times, boosted their strength, and allowed them to function with injuries that should have been fatal. Some of the chemicals we found in their bloodstreams were so toxic that handling them required full protective equipment. Yet humans used them like daily vitamins. One captured pilot had so many combat drugs in his system that our medical scanner couldn't believe he was still alive. When we asked him about it, he just grinned and said it was standard combat protocol. They were systematically poisoning themselves to become better warriors. But the moment that truly broke my understanding of warfare came when we finally managed to capture some of their ground forces during a raid on their moon base. We brought them aboard our flagship for interrogation, expecting to learn about their military structure and battle plans. Veldo's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Under questioning, these prisoners told us something that made my blood run cold. They explained that we hadn't been fighting their real military at all. Every pilot we had faced, every soldier we had encountered, every crew member who had died ramming ships into our fleet, none of them were professional warriors. They were scientists, engineers, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, and artists who had volunteered to fight when their planet was threatened. The humans we thought were elite soldiers were actually civilians who had learned warfare in a matter of weeks. They had been improvising everything, their tactics, their weapons modifications, even their suicidal battle strategies. When I asked where their actual military was, one of the prisoners smiled and said, "They're still coming. We just bought them time to get ready." That's when I understood that everything we had experienced was just the opening act, the real show hadn't even started yet. At that moment, staring at these amateur warriors who had devastated our professional fleet, I realized a horrible truth. We had always believed that we Thorans were the apex predators of the galaxy. We had conquered system after system, species after species, always confident in our superiority. But humans showed us that we had never actually met a real predator before. We were just prey that had gotten lucky for a few thousand years. And now we had awakened something that made us look like helpless children playing with toy weapons. Veldos slowly pushed himself up from the interview chair, his massive six-limbed frame shaking with the effort. Every movement sent pain through old wounds that had never properly healed. The scars covering his armored hide seemed to pulse with remembered agonies. He prepared to deliver his final warning to the galaxy. The war that was supposed to last 3 days stretched on for 6 brutal months, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of total defeat. By the end, we had lost everything that mattered to our civilization. Our mighty fleet of 2,000 ships was reduced to barely 300 damaged vessels limping home. In disgrace, our colonial empire, built over centuries of conquest, crumbled as human forces swept through our territories like a plague. But the ships and colonies weren't the worst losses. The humans didn't just defeat us in battle. They made our entire way of life obsolete. For thousands of years, we Thorans had been the apex predators of this galaxy. We were the species that other civilizations feared and respected. Our military academies were considered the finest in known space. Our generals were legends whose tactics were studied across dozens of star systems. Veldos' voice grew bitter. In 6 months, the humans reduced all of that to ancient history. They didn't just beat us. They made us irrelevant. Every military strategy we had developed over millennia became worthless. Every weapon we had perfected became a museum piece. They forced us to realize that we had been playing a children's game while they were mastering the art of war itself. When the ceasefire was finally signed, I expected the humans to demand hushed terms, total surrender, occupation of our home world, maybe even the execution of our military leadership. That's what we would have done if we had won. Instead, something happened that I still don't understand. The old commander's eyes grew distant as he recalled that final encounter. A human admiral came aboard our surrender vessel to negotiate the peace terms. I had prepared myself to meet some kind of monster, a savage warlord who would gloat over our defeat and humiliate us further. Instead, I found myself face to face with the most unexpected sight I had ever seen. She was small, barely reaching my shoulder even when I was sitting down. Her hair was turning grey, and she had kind eyes that seemed to hold genuine compassion. She looked more like someone's grandmother than the commander of the force that had just destroyed our civilization. She wore a simple uniform with no fancy decorations or intimidating armor. The first thing she did was offer medical aid for our wounded. She brought human doctors aboard our ship to treat injuries that our own medical staff couldn't handle. She arranged for safe passage home for all our surviving crews and even provided food and supplies. For the journey, I couldn't understand why she was being so merciful. Veldos' voice became puzzled. I had to ask her directly, "Why are you showing us kindness after we came here to exterminate your entire species?" I expected some kind of political answer about human superiority or moral high ground. Instead, she gave me a smile that was both warm and terrifying. She said, Because we want you to go home and tell everyone what you learned here. At first, I thought she was just being diplomatic, but as I looked into her eyes, I realized she was completely serious. The humans had fought this entire war not just to defend themselves, but to send a message to the rest of the galaxy. They wanted survivors. They wanted witnesses. They wanted every species in known space to hear exactly what had happened when someone was foolish enough to threaten humanity. We weren't just defeated enemies. We were living advertisements for human military capability. Veldos turned to face the recording device directly, his scarred face filling the camera's view. So I'm telling you now, for the historical record and as a warning to any species foolish enough to consider aggression against humanity, they are not like us. They are not like anyone else in this galaxy. Most species fight for a territory, resources, or political advantage. We conquer worlds to expand our empires or gain access to valuable materials. We wage war too. Achieve specific goals and then stop when those goals are met. Humans don't follow that logic. They don't fight for a territory or resources or glory. They fight because fighting is what they are. Every single human is a soldier waiting to be activated. I learned this during our intelligence gathering after the war. Their children grow up playing games that simulate warfare. They call it entertainment, but it's actually combat training disguised as fun. Their teenagers spend hours every day practicing with simulated weapons and learning military tactics through something they call video games. Their civilians practice combat as recreation. They have entire industries built around teaching ordinary people how to fight. They call it martial arts and self-defense, but it's really a society-wide military training program that never stops. Even their elderly citizens know how to handle weapons and basic combat tactics. Their culture worships warrior heroes from thousands of years of constant conflict. They have stories and songs about battles that happened before they even had space travel. They remember the names of soldiers who died in wars that ended centuries ago. They have turned the study of warfare into an art form that they pass down through generations. Veldos moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back one final time. We thought we were conquering a primitive species that had barely discovered space travel instead. We awakened a civilization that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other. They had fought wars across every continent of their planet, in every possible environment, with every conceivable weapon. When we arrived, they simply turned all that accumulated expertise on us. We were facing the collected military wisdom of an entire species that had never known true peace. They had been preparing for this war for their entire evolutionary history, without even knowing it. The humans have a saying that I finally understand now. If you want peace, prepare for war. We never understood that philosophy until we met them. They are always prepared for a war because they never stopped fighting it, even during their peaceful periods. They were studying conflict and developing new ways to destroy their enemies. The galaxy is safer now that we know our place in it. Below them, far below them, and I pray to our ancestors that no other species is stupid enough to forget this lesson. Veldos reached for the door handle, his scarred claws clicking against the metal. Remember this, young historian. The humans didn't just defeat us. They gave us a gift, the gift of knowing exactly where we stand in the cosmic order. We are not the apex predators we thought we were. We are prey that got lucky for a few thousand years, and now we know what real predators look like. Asterisk, asterisk, the end asterisk, asterisk.